June 1944, northern France. The countryside was quiet, but the silence was heavy, tense, and unnatural. German infantry crouched in the hedgerows, rifles steady, ears tuned to the distant thunder rolling across the earth. It wasn't thunder from the sky. It was the growl of engines, Sherman tanks. The soldiers smirked in grim anticipation. The Americans were sending in their thin-skinned machines again, the so-called Ronsons that lit up at the first spark. German gunners knew their Panthers and Tigers were superior. Heavier armor, longer guns, better optics. The battlefield had taught them this truth again and again. But then, something happened that doctrine had never prepared them for. The Shermans didn't come down the obvious road. They didn't grind forward into the traps laid so carefully the night before. Instead, the rumble grew, shifted, spread, and suddenly, without warning, green silhouettes burst not from the front but from the flanks. One tank tore through a hedgerow, another crashed across an open field, a third appeared from a sunken lane no one thought passable. Confusion rippled through the German lines. Their ambush collapsed before it began. The Shermans were everywhere, moving with uncanny precision like a single organism. One advanced while another covered. One pinned down German infantry, while another maneuvered around to strike from behind. How could this be? German doctrine insisted that coordination on such a scale required line of sight, signals waved by flags, blaring horns, or visible commands from officers. Yet these American tanks, separated by terrain and smoke, acted as though they shared the same mind. Reports came back to German headquarters again and again with the same story. American Shermans, outgunned, out-armored, striking from unexpected angles, overwhelming positions with a coordination that seemed impossible. It wasn't brute force. It wasn't luck. Something invisible guided them. The Panther may have had the bigger gun. The Tiger may have had the thicker hide. But on the battlefields of France, German troops began whispering of something else. Some unseen advantage that made the Shermans faster, smarter, more alive. In the chaos of war, seconds decide survival. And somehow the Americans always seemed to be seconds ahead. German soldiers asked themselves, how do they know? How do they move like this? The truth was all around them, humming in the very air. The invisible battlefield, where the most important weapon left no trail of smoke or fire, but passed silently through the ether. Because the secret of the Sherman wasn't what the Germans could see. The answer wasn't bigger guns or thicker armor. It was hidden in the airwaves. By the middle of the Second World War, one tank had come to define the American war effort, the M4 Sherman. Its boxy silhouette, its rounded turret, and its high-pitched engine growl became the soundtrack of the Allied advance from North Africa to Normandy. But for all its ubiquity, the Sherman carried a reputation as both a blessing and a curse. German propaganda delighted in mocking it. They nicknamed it the Tommy Cooker, a cruel nod to the field stoves British soldiers used, claiming it lit up just as quickly when hit. Allied troops themselves took up the name Ronson, after the popular cigarette lighter whose slogan was, "Lights every time." Inside the claustrophobic steel hull, crews lived with the constant knowledge that one well-placed shot from a German 88mm gun could turn their machine into a burning coffin. The comparisons to the German heavyweights seemed damning. The Tiger tank, weighing nearly twice as much, could shrug off Sherman rounds at ranges where its own cannon punched through American armor with ease. The Panther, sleek and deadly, brought firepower and armor together in a near-perfect balance. By contrast, the Sherman's 75mm gun was often inadequate against these beasts, and its thinner armor made it vulnerable from almost any angle. Even Allied soldiers grew cynical. They joked that Shermans didn't win battles. American industry did. They believed that their survival depended not on the tank's design but on sheer numbers. If a Sherman burned, another rolled off the assembly line in Detroit ready to take its place. And indeed, numbers were staggering. More than 50,000 Shermans were produced by war's end, flooding Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. To many, this was the tank's only true strength, quantity. A wave of mediocrity overwhelming a handful of German masterpieces. But this narrative missed something. Something most German tank crews never realized. Something even Allied soldiers often overlooked as they cursed their vulnerable armor plates, because the Sherman had advantages invisible to the eye. It was reliable, starting on freezing mornings when German engines refused. It was lighter, able to cross bridges that collapsed beneath the weight of a Tiger. It was standardized, allowing parts to be swapped, crews to be retrained, and tanks to be repaired in hours instead of days. Yet beyond all of this lay a secret edge, one that had nothing to do with armor thickness or gun caliber. An edge hidden not in steel, but in the unseen world of communication. The Sherman could talk. Inside each of these tanks, bolted into place as standard issue, was a device that transformed them from isolated machines into a coordinated force. Crews spoke to each other across miles of battlefield, maneuvering like a single organism. It was this unseen voice that allowed Shermans to outmaneuver superior enemies, to appear where they weren't expected, to survive when statistics said they shouldn't. The Germans never grasped it. The Allies rarely celebrated it, but history would reveal the truth. What truly made the Sherman lethal wasn't its cannon, it was its voice. August 1944. Just outside St. Lo, the French countryside shuddered under the weight of war. A German Panther crouched at the edge of a hedgerow, its 75mm gun scanning for targets. The crew inside waited, listening, straining their eyes for movement, and then from the distance they heard it, the rumble of Shermans. Engines roaring, tracks grinding. The Panther commander tensed, expecting them to appear in the obvious gap between two hedges. His gunner adjusted the sights, finger hovering on the trigger. But the Shermans didn't come from the gap. Instead, one appeared directly ahead, another swung wide to the flank, and a third crept in from the rear. Within seconds, the Panther was caught in a crossfire, shells slamming from 3 angles at once. How had they managed it? How had American tanks, spread across broken terrain, managed to move like a single organism, striking with precision that seemed pre-planned? The answer lay not in the steel of the Sherman, but in a small box of circuits and wires mounted inside every one of them. The SCR-508, a two-way frequency modulation radio. It was, in many ways, the Sherman's most important weapon. For most of the war, German armor depended on older amplitude modulation, AM radios. They were prone to static, vulnerable to atmospheric interference, and limited in range. Many German tanks, especially early in the war, didn't even have transmitters, only receivers. This meant that platoon leaders could issue orders, but individual tanks couldn't talk back. A commander had to rely on preset plans, hand signals, or even flags waved through hatches to direct his men. In the chaos of battle where seconds meant survival, this system was slow, fatally slow. The Americans, by contrast, embraced FM radio technology. FM cut through static, delivering transmissions clear enough to be heard over roaring engines and battlefield gunfire. It was resistant to interference and jamming. And most importantly, every Sherman had one. This changed everything. Imagine a platoon of 5 Shermans advancing through a village. The lead tank spots an enemy anti-tank gun hidden behind a farmhouse. In German doctrine, that tank might be forced to fight alone until others noticed the threat, or until a commander found a way to wave new orders into view. But in an American platoon, the moment the gun was spotted, the commander pressed his throat microphone. Instantly, every Sherman in the formation knew the target, knew its location, and adjusted their positions to attack. One tank pinned the gun down, another maneuvered to the flank, a third laid smoke to mask movement. Within minutes, a threat that could have destroyed half the platoon was eliminated with minimal loss. This was the power of the radio. Speed, coordination, flexibility. German crews often fought like individual gladiators, relying on superior armor and gunnery, but struggling to adapt quickly when plans unraveled. American crews, with radios humming in their ears, fought like a team. They shifted tactics on the fly, reacting to danger and exploiting opportunity faster than their opponents could understand. What looked like luck on the battlefield, Shermans arriving from unexpected angles, ambushes collapsing before they began, was in fact communication. A web of voices, transmitted through invisible waves, weaving individual tanks into a single deadly machine, and the Germans never saw it. They couldn't, because the battlefield advantage wasn't painted in camouflage or forged in armor. It whispered in the ether, hidden in technology so advanced it might as well have been magic. But here's the twist. These weren't just radios, humming with orders and warnings. They were something more, because these weren't just radios. They were the smartest battlefield brains of their time. Long before Sherman tracks clattered through Normandy, a quieter battle was being fought in the laboratories and workshops of America. It was not waged with rifles or artillery, but with soldering irons, blueprints, and vision. Here, in the hands of the U.S. Army Signal Corps and American industry, the Sherman's most powerful weapon was born. The challenge was immense. A tank is no friendly place for delicate electronics. Inside, the temperature could soar past 100 degrees. The steel hull rattled with vibration as tracks tore across mud and stone. Dust clogged every surface. And above all, the roar of engines and the thunder of battle created a storm of interference. For a radio to work in that environment, it had to be almost indestructible. Enter the engineers of Motorola, RCA, and Western Electric. Tasked with turning fragile civilian technology into battlefield muscle, they created the SCR-508, the heart of Sherman communication. Its secret lay in frequency modulation, or FM. Unlike AM radios that hissed and crackled under static, FM sliced through the noise with crystal clarity. It didn't fade with distance, it didn't crumble under the rumble of engines, and it resisted the enemy's attempts at jamming. But making it battlefield-ready required genius. Engineers mounted components on shock-absorbing frames to survive endless jolts. Cooling systems were added to keep circuits alive under sweltering heat. Frequencies were crystal-controlled, allowing channels to stay locked in even while tanks bounced over uneven ground. What emerged was not just a radio, but a rugged lifeline, a device so dependable that Sherman crews soon took it for granted. This reliability enabled something new, something visionary, a networked battlefield. Each Sherman became not just a fighting machine, but a node in a fast-reacting web. Information flowed instantly across platoons and companies. One tank's eyes became the vision of all. One commander's decision rippled across dozens of vehicles in seconds. The Shermans no longer fought as scattered units. They fought as a single, coordinated organism. Across the lines, the Germans took a different path. High command believed in centralized orders, not flexible field coordination. Radios were expensive and production was slow. Most German tanks carried only receivers. Crews could listen, but not answer. Signals were passed by hand, by flags, or by pre-arranged plans that crumbled the moment reality shifted. Even when transmitters were installed, their AM systems sputtered and failed under interference. Overconfidence sealed the rest. The Wehrmacht trusted its superior optics, thicker armor, and powerful guns. They believed brute strength would dominate the battlefield. Why waste resources on radios, when tigers and panthers already inspired fear wherever they rolled? The result was a blind spot, a hidden weakness disguised beneath steel, a weakness that American engineers had quietly solved before the first Sherman even landed in Europe. The battlefield was no longer just about who had the biggest gun. It was about who could act, react, and adapt fastest. And America's invisible web of voices was about to tip the scales. And soon, the Germans would discover, too late, just how devastating this invisible weapon could be. The desert of Tunisia in early 1942 was no stranger to battle. Dust clouds hung heavy in the air. Sunburned crews crouched behind sand-colored armor, and the thunder of engines rolled across the barren landscape. Into this unforgiving theater arrived a newcomer, the American Sherman. Fresh from the factories of Detroit, its crews were green, its tactics untested. The Germans expected easy prey. At first glance, their confidence seemed justified. The Afrika Korps had been hardened by years of desert warfare. Their Panzer III and IV tanks carried seasoned crews drilled in ambush and maneuver. The Americans, by contrast, often made rookie mistakes. Clumsy formations, poor gunnery, and at times reckless charges. Yet amid these blunders, the Germans began noticing something deeply unsettling. Time and again, ambushes that should have left U.S. units paralyzed ended with coordinated counterattacks. Platoons that had been scattered by artillery fire regrouped in minutes. Fresh orders seemed to ripple across the American lines with uncanny speed. For German officers accustomed to watching enemies collapse into chaos, the sight was baffling. One panzer commander, after observing a skirmish near Kasserine, reported the phenomenon with a mix of respect and frustration. "The Americans are amateurs," he wrote, "but their tanks behave as if guided by one mind. They attack from multiple directions almost instantly. It is as though every vehicle knows the position of the others." The secret was hidden inside every Sherman. While most German tanks carried little more than a receiver to hear instructions, the Americans had equipped nearly all their vehicles with full two-way FM radios. When a platoon was caught in a German crossfire, the lead Sherman could instantly warn the others, direct them to flank, and call for artillery support, all while on the move. For the first time, green American crews could recover from mistakes in real time. Even if a commander misread the terrain or drove his tanks into an ambush, his men weren't trapped by silence. With a few words over the radio, they regrouped, shifted tactics, and struck back. The Germans, bound by hand signals and rigid pre-planned maneuvers, found themselves outmaneuvered by opponents they had dismissed as novices. To the Africa Corps, it seemed supernatural. How could such inexperienced troops adapt so quickly? How could scattered units knit themselves back into fighting shape in moments? The answer lay not in the gun barrels or the steel plates of the Sherman, but in the invisible threads of communication binding them together. The shock of North Africa planted the first seeds of doubt. The Germans still held the upper hand tactically, and their battlefield victories in Tunisia reinforced that belief. Yet beneath the surface, an invisible revolution was underway. The Americans had discovered how to fight as a network, and every skirmish made them more dangerous. North Africa was only the opening act. The true test, the moment when radios would prove decisive on a scale the world had never seen, was yet to come. But this was only the beginning. The real test came on D-Day. June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy erupted in fire and steel. Thousands of American soldiers fought their way inland under withering German fire. Behind them, the Sherman tanks rolled off landing craft, their engines roaring, treads grinding into the soft sand. For these crews, survival meant more than armor or firepower. It meant communication. The hedgerows of Normandy were unlike anything the Americans had trained for. Centuries-old earthen walls, thick with tangled roots and hedges, carved the countryside into a deadly maze. Visibility collapsed to mere yards. A Sherman could be 20 feet from a German Panther and not see it until the muzzle flash of an 88mm gun lit the greenery. Every intersection was an ambush waiting to happen. In this claustrophobic battlefield, radios became the lifeline. Sherman commanders, crouched in their turrets with throat microphones pressed tight, called out every movement. Panther, left flank. Infantry pinned down ahead. Artillery fire mission grid 4729. Within seconds, artillery shells screamed overhead, slamming into German strongpoints. Infantry squads advanced under the cover of tank fire, guided by constant chatter between units. Even fighter bombers were vectored onto targets by Sherman crews relaying coordinates over the net. For the Germans, it was the opposite. Their tanks were individually superior, Panthers and Tigers with guns that could punch through a Sherman from half a mile away. But they fought alone. A Panther waiting in ambush might score a devastating first hit, yet without reliable radios across every vehicle, its comrades often didn't know where the enemy was. When American tanks swarmed with coordinated crossfire, that Panther became just another burning wreck in the hedgerows. One skirmish near St. Lo revealed the difference radios made. A Sherman platoon moved cautiously along a sunken road when the lead tank exploded under the blast of a Panther's cannon. In another army, at another time, panic might have spread. But within seconds, the surviving Sherman commander broadcast the enemy's position. The remaining tanks split, two circling left, one right. While the Panther focused on its latest target, the Shermans closed from both flanks. Their 75mm shells clanged harmlessly off its armor. But the distraction allowed an American tank destroyer, summoned by radio, to position itself and fire. The Panther erupted in smoke and flame. That kill was not luck. It was orchestration. It was proof that radios turned vulnerable Shermans into predators that fought as one. German survivors could hardly believe it. They had trained under a doctrine of strict hierarchy. Wait for orders, execute the plan. But here their opponents seemed to think together, react together, strike together. And in the hedgerows of Normandy, that speed of adaptation mattered more than raw power. Every day after D-Day, this invisible edge widened. American armored divisions pushed inland not as scattered companies, but as living networks. When an ambush halted one spearhead, radio calls summoned flanking units, artillery, even airstrikes, knitting the fight into a fluid counteroffensive. By the end of June, German commanders faced a grim realization. Their mighty panzers, once symbols of unstoppable power, were being hunted down, one by one, not by bigger guns but by better voices carried on invisible airwaves. Normandy proved a brutal truth, that the battlefield no longer belonged to the strongest tank, but to the best connected one. And then came the moment when radios didn't just win battles, they saved entire armies. Late July, 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy, which had slowed the Allied advance to a crawl, were about to give way. Operation Cobra began with a thunderous aerial bombardment, the earth shaking as thousands of tons of bombs carved a gap in the German lines. Through the smoke and rubble, Sherman tanks roared forward, columns stretching for miles, engines howling in unison. This was no chaotic rush. It was a carefully orchestrated storm. Each Sherman carried a voice, and through those voices, the American armored divisions became something the Germans had never faced before, a moving web of steel and coordination. Radios kept the momentum alive when the battlefield threatened to collapse into confusion. When one column struck resistance, a single broadcast could summon artillery support or direct neighboring units to bypass the strong point. When bridges were destroyed or roads jammed with refugees, new routes were found within minutes. The battlefield, once rigid and hierarchical, had become fluid and responsive. No one embodied this better than General George S. Patton and his Third Army. Patton's doctrine of relentless speed would have been impossible without universal radios. His armored columns didn't lumber across France, they sprinted. Orders leapt from headquarters to divisions to battalions to platoons in near real time. A maneuver that might have taken days in the German army unfolded in hours for the Americans. The results stunned the enemy. German reports describe bewilderment at the Allies' ability to appear in places they could not possibly have reached so quickly. An infantry division ordered to hold a town found itself flanked within a day. Panzer reserves moving to block one spearhead discovered another had already swept past them miles to the south. The pace shattered the very idea of a coherent defense. A German officer captured near Avranches voiced his disbelief. "You do not fight battles. You flow around us like water. We cannot stop water." This was radio-driven blitzkrieg, an evolution of the very tactics the Germans had pioneered years earlier, now turned against them with terrifying efficiency. The breakout across France was not just a victory of tanks over tanks. It was a victory of information over isolation. The Sherman's radios transformed columns into living organisms, able to adapt instantly to terrain, resistance, and opportunity. By the time Patton's men reached the Seine, the German army was in tatters. Entire units were encircled, bypassed, or cut off before they realized the danger. And at the heart of it all was a simple truth. Coordination at the speed of voice could outmatch even the deadliest guns and armor. The Allies surged forward. Propelled by momentum, the Germans could neither predict nor counter. Yet in desperation, the Reich prepared one final gamble, a last attempt to break the tide. But while the Allies surged forward, the Germans tried one last gamble. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay buried beneath a heavy cloak of snow. Trees sagged under frozen weight, fog clung to the valleys, and the silence of winter was shattered by the roar of German artillery. The last great German offensive, what history would call the Battle of the Bulge, had begun. The Wehrmacht struck with ferocity and surprise. Panzer divisions surged through the mist, their treads grinding ice and snow. American units, scattered across villages and crossroads, were caught off guard. For a moment, it seemed as though the German gamble might succeed, splitting the Allied front and driving to the Meuse. But there was one advantage the Americans carried into that frozen nightmare: their radios, Sherman crews, shivering inside metal hulls that offered little warmth, gripped throat microphones with gloved hands. Even as shells fell and columns scattered, they spoke to one another across the airwaves. "Enemy armor sighted, north approach. Requesting fire on grid 1617. Reinforcements moving, hold your ground." These voices kept order in the chaos. Isolated groups of Shermans, cut off by snow-choked roads, refused to vanish into silence. They called for artillery support, and within minutes batteries miles away sent fire crashing onto advancing German armor. Infantry units huddled in foxholes relayed positions through tank radios, turning every Sherman into a battlefield hub. In towns like St. Vith and Bastogne, American tankers held crossroads that the Germans desperately needed. A handful of Shermans with radios crackling became anchors for entire defensive lines. Even when surrounded, they coordinated with nearby units, shifting reserves and summoning support. For the Germans, the story was very different. Their assault relied on precision timing and rapid advances, but their communication systems could not match the pace of battle. Many tanks carried only receivers. When command vehicles were destroyed, platoons were left leaderless. Fog and forest made hand signals useless. Pre-planned orders crumbled against the shifting resistance of American units that adapted minute by minute. One German officer later admitted that his tanks often attacked as if blind, never certain where neighboring units were or whether support was coming. Time and again, American defenders bought precious hours, not with superior firepower, but with the ability to remain connected. By January, the German offensive had stalled. The Ardennes became a graveyard of panzers abandoned in the snow, their fuel tanks empty, their radios silent. The Americans, though battered, had endured, because their voices carried across the frozen battlefield when nothing else could. The Battle of the Bulge was the final, brutal test of the Sherman's hidden weapon. In fog and snow, where even sight failed, the invisible threads of radio communication bound American forces together, turning scattered defenders into a wall that the Wehrmacht could not break. The war in Europe was drawing to its close, but the lessons of those radios, forged in the Ardennes, would echo far beyond the forests of Belgium. The war in Europe was ending, but the radio's legacy had only begun. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the Sherman's radios did not fade into history. They became the blueprint for the future of war. What began as a battlefield advantage in 1942 grew into a doctrine that would shape NATO, the Cold War, and every conflict since. For the first time, an army had proven that communication was as decisive as firepower. Sherman radios had shown that a tank was not just a machine of steel, but a node in a larger network, a force multiplied by connection. After the war, this principle was woven into NATO doctrine, interoperability, universal radio standards, and the idea that no unit, however small, should ever fight alone. The Cold War magnified this lesson. In Europe, where the threat of Soviet armored divisions loomed, NATO planners emphasized command structures built on seamless communication. Radios no longer just relayed orders. They enabled rapid decision-making across continents. From armored brigades to jet squadrons to missile sites, every element was tied into the same invisible web first glimpsed inside the hull of a Sherman. Technology evolved from analog to digital, from FM sets to satellite links, but the foundation remained the same. Victory belonged to the connected. American doctrine of network-centric warfare in the late 20th century traced its roots directly back to those wartime innovations. When U.S. forces stormed across Kuwait in 1991 or maneuvered into Baghdad in 2003, they echoed the same principle that Sherman crews had proven in Normandy and the Ardennes. That information moves faster than armor, and coordination outmatches chaos. Military historians today still marvel at the irony. The Sherman is remembered for its flaws: thin armor, modest firepower, a reputation as the underdog. Yet its radios changed warfare as profoundly as any cannon or engine of the 20th century. The tank's true strength was invisible, humming across the airwaves, binding men and machines into a force greater than the sum of its parts. The Germans, for all their engineering brilliance, never fully understood what had beaten them. They believed they lost to numbers, to industry, to overwhelming supply. The truth was subtler, hidden in static-free voices and crystal-controlled frequencies. But the most shocking truth is this: German troops never realized what beat them until it was far too late. The Sherman tank is often remembered in photographs, rolling across French villages, climbing the hills of Italy, or bogged down in the mud of Belgium. To most it looked ordinary. Its gun was smaller than the Panthers, its armor thinner than the Tigers, its silhouette unremarkable. And yet behind that plain exterior lay a weapon far more powerful than steel. The Sherman was not merely a tank. It was a communication hub, a moving nerve center on treads. Its radios stitched together the chaos of war into something coherent. They allowed platoons to act like packs of hunters instead of lone wolves, and divisions to surge forward with a speed and precision that left enemies stunned. Radios turned thousands of average machines into one coordinated fist. This was the paradox of the Sherman. On paper, it was outmatched. On the battlefield, it proved lethal. Not because of what the enemy could see, but because of what they could not. Invisible voices guided maneuvers, summoned artillery, and shifted strategies in real time. Where German tanks fought as isolated giants, the Sherman fought as part of a living organism. The lesson is timeless. Firepower may win moments, but information wins wars. The side that sees more, hears more, and reacts faster holds the true advantage. Radios made that possible in World War II. They remind us that sometimes the most decisive weapon isn't a shell or a gun. It's the unseen thread that connects one soldier to another. As we look back, the Sherman's greatest triumph wasn't in its armor or its cannon, but in its voice. A voice carried across fields and forests, through static and smoke, binding ordinary men into extraordinary teams. And perhaps the greatest reflection for us today is this: if radios could reshape the outcome of World War II, what unseen technology might be reshaping the wars of tomorrow? If radios could win World War II battles, What unseen technology might be reshaping warfare today?